Start. Okay, we got the recording started. Anusha did send everybody an email with the PowerPoint attachment, so just so you know, it's sitting in your email box if you haven't found it yet. I'm trying to upload it onto my site. I'm having a problem today, but you all have it at least in an email, and Anusha's going to use it for this session as well. So this will be the last of our pre-August module sessions, and of course we'll be together in a very short time, so getting super excited about that. And then we'll start up another series of webinars following the August module, and we'll announce the dates. We're going to keep it on the Wednesdays. But anyway, I'll let you get started, Anusha, and I will come back you're doing an hour and a half, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll shut this down at 9:30.
Okay.
Have fun.
Thank you. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to continue on with where we left off in Pancha Nidana. So before we get started, let's start with a prayer. Yo Vishwam Vidadhati Pati Satatam Samharayatyanjasa Srishtva Divya Mahauschadischa Vividhan Duri Karotyamayan Vibhrano Jalana Chakasti Bhuvani Piyushapurnam Ghatam Tam Dhanvantari Rupamishamamalam Vandamahe Shreyase Vandamahe Shreyase Vandamahe Shreyase. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. So welcome back, everyone. So in the last class, what we had talked about was we looked at the different definitions of disease as per Ayurveda, and we also looked at all of the various classifications of causative factors or different types of nidanas. And this is important for us as we had looked at the process of manifestation of a disease, and looking at, you know, the variations of the doshas and how it may rise or fall. And these are things that we knew before, but this is looking at it in a much more detailed aspect. So in today's class as well, it's going to get very detailed, so just a little bit of a warning now. And don't worry if you don't understand all of it all at once. The reason I put it out there is because all of this information is going to start trickling in when we get to each one of the modules. So for instance, when we start looking at specific disorders and how they manifest, that's when we're going to start applying this information that we're learning right now. And when we start to see the nuances of how a disease develops or why it responds or does not respond to certain things, then this is the basis of that process that's happening. This is the knowledge by how we understand what's happening in the body. So even if you don't understand all of it now, the good thing is that it is recorded, so you can always go back to this information. You can always go back to this topic, and you have all of the different classifications and the different explanations written down that's in this PowerPoint, in the file, as well as it's going to be on the video. Okay, so I don't expect you to get to grasp all of it immediately because it is quite dense and it is a lot of information, but I wanted to have this available to you so that as we go along in each one of the following modules, you can always refer back to this. And then, you know, sometimes you may have some of those aha moments like, oh, now I get it, now I see. how this is applicable over there. Because this is the concept or the theory, and as we get into the disease, that's going to be the practical application of these theories. Okay? Okay, so we left off last week just at the end of Nidana and a brief description of the Shadkriya Kala, or the 6 stages of pathogenesis or samprapti. Okay, and so now what we're going to look at a little bit more is the other parts of the Pancha Nidana. So in Nidana, there are 2, as I briefly described before, there are 2 methods or descriptions for the word Nidana. Nidana can be understood as causative factors, which is typically what we know. And Nidana here in this perspective, where it is Pancha Nidana, it is a method for diagnosing. Okay, so these are all the 5 factors that we look at in order to truly understand a disease and how it has developed and what are all the factors that are playing into it. So once we truly understand that disease or that manifestation, then it becomes that much more simple for us to figure out what we need to then do to treat it or to get rid of it. Okay, so today's class I'm going to start off with purva rupa, and this is the 13th slide on the PowerPoint. Okay. Okay. So purva rupas are known as premonitory symptoms, signs and symptoms. And as remember when we looked at the Shadkriya Kala, or the 6 stages of pathogenesis, the purva rupas, or the premonitory signs and symptoms, tend to show up during the 4th stage of pathogenesis. And this usually happens when either the dosha has increased so much so that it is starting to spread to the domain or the place of another dosha, or even in the sense of, and whether that can be either in the major domain of that dosha, or it could even mean spreading to the domain of the dhatu. So remember when we talked about earlier that the doshas are located in specific dhatus that they carry out their function. So for instance, kapha is located or seated in rasa dhatu, pitta is seated in rakta dhatu, kapha is again seated in mamsa and meda dhatu, vata is seated in asti dhatu, and kapha again is seated in majja and shukra dhatu. Okay, so if the dosha, whichever the dosha be it, if that is increasing so much so that it looks for the nearest place, or it looks for the weakest point in the body, and then it spreads to that area, and it gets a chance to then fester and sort of pollute that, either the dosha seated there or even just the structural compound of the dhatu, and it starts to overtake and starts to create more of a problem. So at this stage, when it's the vyadhi or the disease is gaining strength, it is becoming bigger and bigger and stronger, that's when you start to see these premonitory signs and symptoms. And so, for instance, in the classical text, in under the description of each and every disease, they have actually very clearly identified for us, made it very easy for us to understand what the purva rupas, or the signs and symptoms that you see before the disease has become so much apparent that we can name it. These are sort of cautionary signs. This is going to happen. It's almost there. So at this purva rupa stage, if we are able to do our treatment, or if we're able to intervene at that point, we can really stop the development of this process further. And we can really stop it before it becomes a disease. So sometimes actually our scope of practice tends to be in this area. If we are very well versed in picking up the purva rupas, which is happening in a person, then this really gives us a good chance to prevent them from ever having that disease to manifest, for it to ever become a full-blown disease, where we can give it a name and where we recognize it as this particular disease, whatever it may be. Okay? So In the classical text, this again is from Charaka Samhita, Nidana Sthana, first chapter, where they basically talk about the concepts of Nidana. So here they describe that there are two basic types of purva rupas. One which is samanya. Samanya usually always means general. So samanya or general signs and symptoms. For example, if you have pain and fatigue are symptoms of fever as well as tuberculosis. They tend to be very vague and general. You can find these signs and symptoms in multiple disorders. And you also have these other specific types of purva rupas, such as, which is known as visheshaja. So vishesha purva rupas are those which is specific to a particular disease. So example of that, there are two types of that as well. One is avyakta, which is the signs and symptoms which are not clearly manifested, such as back pain. And the other is doshaja, which is that which is specific to the dosha, such as netardaha, or burning sensation in the eyes, for a pittaja type of jvara, or a pittaja type of fever. Okay, so what do I mean by these specific signs and symptoms, or these general signs and symptoms? In the case of where we're looking at here, remember we were talking about the timeline and the pathogenesis of a disease? As we can see here, even when you get to the stage of purva rupa, that's not the beginning of the disease. The beginning stages, or the sort of pathway of how this develops, started long before you get even the purva rupa, which is sort of described in the 6 stages of samprapti, which we earlier looked at. So what happens is, you have all of this underlying festering of doshas, okay? It starts off here, it starts off with these causative factors. You get a mild disturbance, something that's indicating, well, I don't exactly feel healthy, or something's wrong, I don't feel right, but you just don't know what it is. It's vague, it's underlying, something's happening, but it isn't strong enough. Now, this is what we talked about in Vyadhi, Vyadhi bala, or Roga bala and Rogi bala. So we talked about the strength of the Roga, or the strength of the disease, and as it's gaining strength, and as it's picking up momentum, and it's collecting all of these different qualities from these other factors, such as your food, or your lifestyle, or even the season factors, or even the time of the day, or the time of the night, or any other factors that affect the change or the fluctuation of doshas. As it keeps building, all of this is happening underlying before it gets a chance to really appear or manifest. So the first stage is where it's really starting to show up, and you're starting to see what is happening internally, is the purva rupa stage. Okay, and if that keeps building and growing, then it advances to the rupa stage. Okay, so when you have here these avyakta signs and symptoms which are not clearly manifested, it's showing that these doshas are definitely aggravated. They are definitely in the vikriti, or the aggravated state, and it has now started to produce symptoms. But even the symptoms here are still not clear enough for us to really give it a name for the disease. So the great example for that is back pain, because you tend to have back pain in a lot of different conditions as well, even though it's specific to disease. So an example of back pain specific to disease is sciatica. In sciatica, even in the early stages of sciatica, it starts off with back pain. The first symptoms, or the first issue that they face, is usually back pain. And it comes and it goes, and it wavers here and there. And that coming and going, remember, of the back pain is basically looking at these factors. Remember right here where I was telling you, sometimes it's the seasonal variation, or their dietary habits, or their lifestyle habits that can feed into this dosha being aggravated, giving more strength to the disease for it to then develop and manifest, advancing from just back pain to becoming sciatica? Or if you have these other factors that are in favor of the patient and not in favor of the disease, then it starts to regress. And then it goes back into, again, a more latent stage, or it regresses completely back to a state of health. Okay? So in looking at this is what we look at purva rupas as these little sort of indicators that this disease may be forming. Okay? So if we are very well versed, or if we take a lot of time to learn these purva rupas of specific diseases, then it makes it all that much easier for us to then understand what exactly is happening in the body and what we need to do to correct that. Okay, so that we don't give more or feed more into the roga bala. Instead, we do factors, or we do different interventions that is going to enhance the rogi bala. Okay, so those are the purva rupas, or the premonitory signs and symptoms. The next is the rupa stage. So in the rupa stage here, or rupa is the actual signs and symptoms of a disease. At this point, rupa literally means that it is something that can be seen. It has a name and a form. Because it is seen, we can then give it a name. You can recognize it. Okay, so at this stage, it's an outward appearance. So whatever was happening underneath, all those variations and the fluctuation of doshas was happening quietly, now becomes apparent. And once it becomes apparent, and it's not just mildly apparent or starting to peek out a little bit, it has now come out directly in front of you, and you can actually see it now. Say, oh yes, now I know what you have. So it's not just back pain, but it's back pain with the cardinal sign of the pain radiating down the leg. And when the pain starts radiating down the leg, then you know this is definitely sciatica, right? So as before, it was just the general sort of discomfort or the different intensities of back pain. But from back pain, it has then progressed to become a radiating pain down the back of the leg, which is a cardinal sign or symptom, or a rupa for sciatica, or the Sanskrit term for sciatica is gridrasi, and we're going to talk about that in the coming module. Okay? So since there are signs and symptoms that are apparent, then the disease can have a form to which we attach a name, or to which we give it a name. So for instance, once there is appearance of the pile mass, that indicates that the person has hemorrhoids, right? If there's a pile mass, there's hemorrhoids. Usually the purva rupa for that is typically something like constipation or gas or difficulty in passing bowels. However, those are the purva rupas for ushas. However, here you have, once you have the appearance, once the pile mass forms and it's there, you know it's there, then that definitely means that the person has hemorrhoids, right? Hemorrhoids is basically, it's a pile mass. So if they have that, that is the sign or the symptom of this particular disease. So there are synonyms, different words or terms used for rupa. This again is also described in Charaka Samhita. Different signs or synonyms that we use for rupa is linga, which also means general or specific features of a disease. Lakshana also means signs and symptoms that are observed by the patient and the physician. Okay, so one great thing that the acharyas did when they wrote these texts is they wrote in both perspectives, what the patient is going to describe to you, what they're feeling, as well as what you are going to observe in the patient. Okay, so lakshana is those signs and symptoms that you both can observe. So for instance, if someone's telling you that they have dry skin or they have cracks in their feet, in their heels, that's something that the patient observes, and it is something that you can also see, you can also observe. So those are very clear-cut signs and symptoms. There are also certain symptoms that usually only the physician can understand, but not necessarily something that the patient will tell you. And that is where we use our tools such as our inference. So an example for that, for instance, a great example of this is grahani. When the person tells you that they immediately after they eat, they have to run to the bathroom or they have to go to the bathroom, that is with your inference of knowing what this condition is, you know that definitely they will have an issue with their agni and they will have an issue with their grahani, because that is, again, it is a sign indicating that there's a problem with grahani. That's something that you, as the practitioner, can understand. That's not something that the patient is going to tell you, unless they have studied Ayurveda and they're going to telling you that there's a problem with my grahani, which is very rare. That's not necessarily going to happen. Not to say it can't, it probably can. But these are certain signs that you are going to pick up because you have these tools, you have this information ahead of time. Okay, so there are certain other symptoms that usually just the patient will tell you. Only they can describe to you. For instance, different types of pain or different types of discomfort that is internal. The patient only can describe that to you. That isn't something that we can observe. That's why if we go back to looking at the different methods of examination, the first is darshana, which is, again, the signs that can be observed through seeing, the signs that can be observed by the physician or by the practitioner. Okay? Sparshana is, again, what you can observe by touch. And the last is prashna, which is those things that you cannot observe through seeing and through palpating. The other things that you still need to find out about, which you need to then ask questions. And the patient is going to tell you what they're feeling. Okay, so in looking at how we're examining or looking at all the different layers of information that we need to collect, this is basically telling you what you need to be looking for, right? So again, our acharyas have really given us a lot of information. They've given us so many tools that we basically have to just make a checklist. And you have all this checklist of all the different signs and symptoms of this disease, and you check off which ones they have and which ones they don't. So either you see it and you check off those boxes, or you ask them questions to then check off those boxes. Okay, so you see now it's actually very methodical and very logical as to how we understand or how we diagnose these different conditions. Okay, so the last is rupa, which is, again, signs and symptoms that appear either in the body or in the mind. So these are all different layers or different nuances of looking at these symptomology or signs and symptoms of a specific disease. So again, in this also there are types. There is samanya, which is general signs and symptoms, and you have vishesha, which is specific signs and symptoms. So in the classical texts, when they talk about the rupa or of a disease, they talk about the general signs and symptoms, and those are things like the person will feel discomfort, they'll feel a pricking pain, or they won't be able to sleep at night, or they may have distension of the abdomen or upward movement of vata. These are all somewhat general signs and symptoms. Then you have specific signs and symptoms that are specific to either the dosha type. Like, for instance, remember when we talked about vata jagrahani or pitta jagrahani or kapha jagrahani, there were specific signs and symptoms for that can be associated only with that type of grahani. Okay, similarly, that is indicated for all different types of diseases as well. So if we go back, like for those, I think almost all of you have one form or the other of the classical texts. This is a nice little exercise or homework that you can do, is you can go back to the classical text and go to the chapter of any disease. whether it be fevers or whether it be diarrhea or ushes, hemorrhoids. Go through the chapter, and in the chapter you will see where they have described which are the general signs and symptoms, which are the purva rupas, and which are the specific signs and symptoms. So they won't term it as specific, but instead what they'll term it as is Vataja type of whatever disease, Pittaja type, and these are the signs and symptoms, Kaphaja type, and these are the signs and symptoms. Okay, so they have specific that can be attributed to only that type of disease. And if, for instance, if you have Tridoshaja, they will have a combination of symptoms from the Vataja type, the Pittaja type, and the Kaphaja type. Okay? So looking at this, again, why do we need to know all this? We need to know all of this, again, because it really gives us, again, another indication of how severe or how chronic or how deep is this issue? How deep is this problem? Now, as we have seen here, these problems don't just appear all of a sudden. They progress over a certain period of time. And when they do progress over a certain period of time, what these signs and symptoms really indicate or give us an idea of is how much work we really need to do to get rid of this, right? Because that's our ultimate aim, is we want them to get back to a state of health, and we want to make sure that they that we can then help this to regress back to a balanced state of the doshas. Okay? So, one second here. What did I do here? Okay, so these are the specific types. The signs and symptoms, again, as described in the classical texts, may include the following. Signs and symptoms of a disease like high body temperature in Jwara or hyperpyrexia. That is one of the cardinal signs and symptoms of Jwara. But Jwara in itself is not just fever. It actually is a disease that describes many, many, many disorders that have one of the main symptoms being hyperpyrexia, but it's not the only symptom. So for instance, now if we look at, there are multiple viruses and disorders that come up that we say is of recent years. But if we look at the progression and the symptoms that is produced by this condition, it can actually almost fall under some of the different types of Jwaras. So for instance, an example of this is the H1N1 virus. That is considered as one type of Sannipataja Jwara, or where it is a Jwara due to involvement of all three doshas. In Chikungunya, I'm probably pronouncing it right. This is how we pronounce it in India. Chikungunya virus, which is spread by mosquitoes. That also is considered one type of Sannipataja Jwara, or a Tridoshaja Jwara. And the treatment for that in India, they have had very good success, a lot of success, in fact, in treating this particular type of virus due to spread of mosquitoes. So even though its causative factor is Aghantuja, or it is from the external, and it's a virus that's coming in because of an external factor, even then the change and the aggravation or imbalance of doshas that is creating is very much similar or representative of what they have described in Sannipataja Jwara. And when we look at those particular signs and symptoms that has been described, when we follow that line of treatment, we're actually getting a lot of success in treating that. So for instance, an example of the Chikungunya virus. This is just, again, for you to understand how we apply all of this information. In the Chikungunya virus, you have fever, right? You have a very intense, very severe fever for about anywhere between 3 to 5 days, or in certain people up to 10 days, they may have the severe high-grade fever. After the fever subsides, they end up having a lot of joint disorders or rheumatic pain, arthralgia. And this pain tends to be consistent unless you do something about it. So we've seen that. I've seen actually in my family, someone had gone to India and they got this and they came back and all they were put on was painkillers. Until now, the intensity of the joint pain tends to reduce over time, but it doesn't ever completely go away. In Ayurveda, this is it's a Sannipata Jwara. It is of 3 doshas involvement, but in this particular Sannipata Jwara, it is Vata that is the highest, then Kapha that's in the middle, and Pittaja that is low. All 3 doshas are involved, but Vata is the highest one, or the most predominant one of the 3 doshas that are involved in the pathogenesis of this disease and of this carrying out. Now, the dosha imbalance there continues. Even after the Jwara is gone, it continues, okay? So just keep that in mind because we're going to talk about that in a second too. So it continues and then it produces this other symptom. The second part of the disease is the arthralgia. So what they have done is they've started using different formulas that first aim at pacifying Vata as well as aim at joint health. So it not only pacifies Vata throughout the body, which is very necessary considering after a high-grade fever, naturally you tend to be depleted, so Vata will increase. But what they also do is, these formulas pacify Vata, as well as they help to induce or to promote joint health. So in that, what I mean by joint health, they help to produce more amount of snigdhata, or the unctuousness in the joint cavity, or in the joint, the synovial cavity. So what that does is then, if there is appropriate, not too much and not too less, appropriate amount of fluid in the synovial cavity or in the joint sac, then that promotes, again, free movement or easy movement of the joints, and it relieves the pain. In this particular type of pain, what you end up having is more of a Vataja type of pain, okay? So this is why, again, it is all 3 doshas involved, but the predominant one in this particular condition is Vata. So we aim at using things that both pacify Vata as well as helps to promote joint health, okay? So looking at that, now no one necessarily knew about chikungunya even about 10, 15 years ago. This was something that was fairly new. When I was studying in college, this was something very, very new that we had heard about. And, but even then, even if that name, we don't have a specific name for that disease in Ayurveda, we look at the signs and symptoms that is happening, that's being produced, or that's showing in that person. And according to these signs and symptoms that we are observing, or that the patient is telling us or describing to us that they are experiencing, we are able to then classify it according to what is there in the classical text. And by also looking at the signs and symptoms, we can use our inference to understand what may be the dosha imbalance and then how we need to approach it. So does that start to make sense now? With all of this very convoluted amount of information, how we're actually applying this. So even though in Ayurveda we don't have the names for all diseases, that's okay. You don't need the names for all diseases. We look at all of these other factors, okay? And by looking at these factors, this is how we determine what our line or course of treatment should be, okay? Okay, so they talk about the invariable signs and symptoms of a disease. They also talk about symptoms caused by the vitiation of doshas, which indicate the type of disease. So an example of that, if a person has sort of a shifting type of pain, or if they have an intermittent, which means sometimes they have the pain and sometimes they don't, it comes and goes, that indicates that it is a Vataja Vriddhi, or it's a Vata Vriddhi sort of condition that's causing sort of this type of headache. So if we look at that shifting sort of pain immediately indicates whether it be shifting pain in the head, so it's a shifting sort of headache, or whether it's a shifting pain somewhere else in the body. The fact that it is intermittent, the fact that it is not constant, Remember Vishama? Vishama, Agni is indicated of Vata. But the whole fact of Vishama, Vishamatva, or that intermittent, not constant irregularity is usually always attributed with Vata. So because we're noticing or we are observing the sign or symptom of it being intermittent, that again indicates that it is a Vataja type of disorder. Okay? So that also comes under this description of signs and symptoms. We also look at symptoms that are indicative of the stage of the disease. So as I gave you my example earlier of chikungunya, right? We have the ama avastha, or the primary stage of the disease, and we have the pakwa avastha, or the secondary stage of disease, also known as jirna avastha, or chronic stage. So in the primary stage of the disease, example chikungunya, in the primary stage, that's when the person has jwara, or that's when the person has the fever, right? That's the first stage of the disease. The first, now, if we look at it and if we were to say, oh, well, they have the fever, so it's just the fever and that's it, and we diagnose it only as fever and not looking at the other factors of it, then we see that that's only the primary stage. Now, if the fever rises and goes away, when the fever goes away, we think, oh, well, the disease is gone. The fever is gone, so the disease is gone. But that's not necessarily the case. In certain conditions, even after the primary stage is over, once it enters into the secondary stage, the disease mutates and it changes and it evolves to become something even greater, different, and even presents in a different way. So again, in the secondary stage of the chikungunya virus, you end up with the arthritic pain. At that point, they don't necessarily need to have the fever as the cardinal symptom of that condition. That's only in the primary stage of the condition. But once they get the joint pain or the arthralgia, that is indicative of the secondary stage. And that pain tends to become chronic. So the longer it's there, the more difficult or the more amount of measures we need to take to then bring it back to a state of balance. I hope this is starting to set in or starting to make a little bit of sense. I know it's a lot. I understand it's a lot. But as we go through diseases, these are going to then start setting off some light bulbs, okay? Okay, so the next is, so that's looking at the amavastha and the pakvavastha, or the primary stage, and the secondary stage, or the chronic stage of a disease. The next is symptoms which arise as a complication of the disease, indicating their prognosis. So an example of this is prameha upadravas, or the complications due to uncontrolled diabetes. So for instance, you have, again, diabetes. You have the typical signs and symptoms of diabetes that we all know of, and that's very much described in classical texts. In fact, it's diabetes is one type of prameha. It's not the only. It's not just prameha. It's one type of prameha. So in that, in any one of the pramehas, or even in diabetes, if it goes uncontrolled, it can produce side effects. It can produce complications or secondary disorders due to the primary disorder, right? So these secondary disorders are known as upadravas. And because when you end up having the manifestation, or you find these signs and symptoms of these upadravas, then that indicates, again, that it is not just in the primary stage. It has gone now to the secondary stage and even to the chronic stage, right? So again, example of this is a person who has diabetes. If their diabetes is uncontrolled, then they end up having these complications such as retinopathy or neuropathy. Neuropathy is a big one, very, very common as a secondary condition of diabetes. So what we know is if the person has neuropathy, whether they have been diagnosed as a diabetic recently or previously, the fact that this neuropathy has manifested indicates that this is a chronic condition. Okay, so by just being able to observe the fact that they have neuropathy indicates that this is not a recent onset of diabetes. This is a fairly old condition of diabetes, and it has progressed so much so that it can now manifest the secondary disorder, such as the neuropathy. Okay? Okay. Now, the last type of signs and symptoms that we may have is that which is a premonitory sign or symptom of death. Not a premonitory sign or symptom of a disease, but these are indicators that there is a very bad prognosis. And these are known as Rishta Lakshanas. So there is these great long chapters, in fact, towards the end of in Ashtanga Sangraha, in Ashtanga Hridaya, it is at the end of Sharirasthana. In Charaka Samhita, it is at the end of the second volume in Indriyasthana. And they talk about all the different signs that indicate imminent death. Okay? And sometimes, even in the description of diseases, they have given you the Rishta Lakshanas, where it tells you particular signs and symptoms to observe in a person that indicates they have gone beyond a stage where we can treat them, that they are in their last stages and we need to just let them be comfortable and let them be, because there isn't anything we can do at that point. Okay? And in a second, I'll describe to you what are the different types of prognosis as described in Ayurveda, which we kind of briefly talked about before, but I'll go into it a little bit more detailed. Okay, so these are different types of signs and symptoms and what all we look at. Remember, back in those days, again, we did not have these different types of instrumentation to determine what is happening. So we needed to use all of this information that we see, either the person is telling us or that we are observing, to infer what is happening in the person. Right? We didn't use these different forms of instrumentation. Now, that's not necessarily a lacuna of the science. If you look at, in the classical texts again, all of the detailed, very, very detailed description about these specific disease disorders, and looking at the purva rupa and the rupa and the samprapti, looking at all of this information, it was actually, if you are very well versed, it's not hard. It's fairly easy. It just takes you the effort to study it. But once you've studied this, it's fairly easy for you to then start picking up immediately. Oh, well, you have this, you have this, you have this. You start to see the samprapti happening in the person and how it has evolved to this particular point. And at that time, it's easy for you to diagnose. You don't really need those instruments to diagnose. Okay? So this is the reason why they have given us so much of detail and really described what it is that they are describing in the later chapters when they talk about disease. Okay? Next is upashaya. So upashaya is a method, sort of like what some people describe it as a trial and error. Upashaya literally means exploration therapy, which is, it is a form of chikitsa. It's a form of treatment or intervention that gives us, again, a much clearer idea as to exactly which dosha is involved. Sometimes you have certain signs and symptoms, again, that are vague, right? You have certain signs and symptoms that are not clear enough for us to truly understand which dosha is involved, because it can be convoluted or it can be a little bit confusing. So what we do is we use these different methods of upashaya to figure out exactly what is happening. Okay? So it is defined as, upashaya is defined as different types of medicines or diet or regimen that brings about happiness, that actually helps to relieve the symptoms of the person, either directly against the cause, directly against the nidana of the disease, or in actually reducing the disease itself, or even both. Okay, and I'll explain what that means in a second. So this procedure is useful in disease conditions that have, again, latent symptoms. if the symptoms are vague, they're not very clear, then sometimes, again, we don't know. We don't know for sure if it is a Vata type, or if it's a Kapha type, or if you have Vata Kapha, which one is more? So if you have both Vata and Kapha involved, right? Both of them are cold. Both of them, the one quality that they both have in common is they both have this cold quality. Which one is it? So an example of this is frozen shoulder. In frozen shoulder, a person tends to usually have a lump, or they feel that their shoulders are so stiff. Now you can have stiffness for both. You can have stiffness both because of Vata. Typically you tend to think stiffness is because of Vata. But if you have a lump there, that also can cause a stiffness. In Vataja also you can have a lump. So how do we know which one is predominant? You can also have conditions where you have Vata and Kapha both together. So how do we know which one to treat first? How do we know which one is number one and which one is number two? We figure that out by doing this procedure, or these different sort of exploratory therapies known as upashaya. If whatever we do is positive and it helps to pacify the condition, or it helps to reduce basically what relief of the symptoms, that is known as upashaya, which is it's a positive reaction. If it is a negative reaction, it increases the condition, then it is known as anupashaya, okay, or the opposite of upashaya. So an example again, frozen shoulder. You have frozen shoulder, the person has a lump on their neck, and they can't lift their arm so freely. They cannot lift their arm above their head. If it is a Vataja type, or if it is due predominantly because of Vata, how do you know that? If you apply oil, it relieves the pain. It relieves the pain, it relieves some of the swelling, and it also tends to increase their flexibility, okay? Conversely, if it is a Kapha type and you apply oil, it makes it worse. It aggravates the condition, they tend to feel more stiffness, and it reduces their flexibility, okay? So this is very important for us to know, because if we assume that all stiffness is due to Vata, or all stiffness or all pain is due to Vata, or all immobility is due to Kapha, then that is why we don't have success in our treatment, because it's not always the case. Sometimes you can have issues due to Vata. Sometimes you can have it due to Kapha. Sometimes you can have it due to both. That Kapha that is blocking the movement of Vata. So even in that condition as well, which one is more predominant determines which one we treat first. Okay? And how do we determine which one is more predominant? By using methods known as upashaya or anupashaya. So this is why some people describe it as trial and error, because by applying or by using different methods such as either a medicine or a diet or a regimen, which is basically vihara. By using any one of these, you can figure out if it is a positive reaction or a negative reaction. Okay? So there are different types of upashayas that have been described. And this is where it gets a little bit complicated. So if you don't completely understand this, again, it's okay. One thing to remember when you're looking at all these different types of an upashaya and an upashaya, we have this general concept, right? Samanya Vishesha Siddhanta, which means like increases like and opposites negate each other, right? So for instance, if you have a hot substance and you have pitta dosha, if you take a hot substance with pitta dosha, it should get aggravated, right? It should aggravate the pitta. Or if you put a cool substance with pitta dosha, they're two opposites, so it should balance off each other, right? That's the typical concept. Now, even in that concept, there are exceptions. And this is what this indicator here, all of this great massive description, is basically what describes how these things work. Okay? So don't worry if you don't understand this right now, but this description here of this chart and then on the next slide basically describes how each and every factor works or does not work in a specific disease condition. Okay? So, what do I mean by that? So there are different types of upashaya. So remember in the definition here, we can have either a medicine, a diet, or a regimen that can either work against the cause of the disease, against the nidana or the hetu, or it can help to reduce the disease or the vyadhi on itself, or it can have a double action. It can both address the cause as well as the disease, right? So in looking at that, that's how we end up with 18 different types. So the first one, hetu viparita, which means it balances off, or it is, this description here is according to what is described in the Samanya Vishesha Siddhanta, or the opposites balance off and the similarities increase. Okay, so for instance, if you have a medicine that helps to negate the cause or the hetu for the disease, that is known as upashaya. So that, for instance, example of this, in a fever that is caused by shita vihara, or by using cold things, or for instance, if you got a fever, if you went out in the winter, in the middle of winter, and it's very, very cold, and you ended up shivering and you got a fever. An example of an upashaya, or something that produces a positive effect that addresses the cause of the disease, is an example of that is dried ginger. Dried ginger is ushna vidya, it's hot in potency. It is opposite to the causative factor for the disease. So that's how it works in a positive manner. Now, does it make sense? So it is known as a hetu viparita aushada, or it is a medicine that is antagonistic to the cause. Okay? Similarly, we have food that can be antagonistic to the cause of the disease. Okay, so we have food that is antagonistic to the cause of the disease. So an example of that, for instance, if a person is fatigued due to or caused by malnutrition, okay, an example is anorexia or bulimia. They have severe fatigue due to malnutrition. The treatment for that, or a positive upashaya treatment for that, would be consumption of meat soup or mamsarasa. So what this mamsarasa does is, it is a food that is against, or that is antagonistic according to the cause of the disease, which is malnutrition. Okay? Now is it starting to make sense? So in this way, we have all of these descriptions for how these specific activities either work against the cause, or if they work against specifically the disease. Now, another way to look at this is, another way to understand this is right here. Remember when we talked about this earlier, where we talked about Nidana Parivarjana or Samprapti Vighatana? In a similar manner, this is what is happening. Either whatever our intervention is addressing the cause, it is working against here, or it is working against here. Okay? So that's what we're looking at in this chart. So when we have all of these different methods, or all of these different factors we can choose from. We can choose ahara, vihara, aushada, Or even apart from all of this, we can choose kriya, which is a procedure. Okay? So, vihara, or activities that work against the cause of disease, an example of that is increase of kapha. If there is an increase of kapha due to excessive sleeping during the day, the treatment for that would be staying awake at night. Okay? Because you're trying to address the actual cause for the condition. Now, look, next type of upashaya is Vyadhi viparita. Okay, so this is antagonistic according to the disease. It's not necessarily addressing the cause, but it is actually addressing the disease itself. Okay, so an example of this, in the case of atisara or diarrhea, if we're using herbs like kudija, okay, and that kudija has this ability or has this quality that it is grahi, it is bowel binding. So the bowel binding factor, when we use this medicine, we are trying to address the disease itself. In diarrhea, there is excessive or loose bowels, excessive expulsion of loose bowels or production of loose bowels. We know that the cause for that is usually due to manda agni. But kudija here is not addressing manda agni. Kudija here is actually addressing the disease, the symptoms of the disease. So you can partially say that this is symptomatic treatment, okay? This factor here is actually kind of symptomatic treatment, where we're looking at treating the disease itself. We're not looking at the root cause, or we're not really addressing the root cause. Now you think, don't we usually always look at the root cause in a disease, or when we look at treatment in Ayurveda? Yes, we typically do. However, sometimes what happens is that the disease itself in a particular stage is so aggressive that you cannot change the Nidana. You have to address the disease itself. An example of that is diarrhea. When a person has diarrhea and they have, say, dysentery, or it's very, very bad, the first and foremost pressing issue is the fact that they are losing a lot of fluid because of this diarrhea. So sometimes the first thing you need to do is stop the diarrhea. Okay, and one way to stop the diarrhea is by using herbs that are grahi, that are bowel binding. That it stops the expulsion of bowels. Okay, and once you stop that, then you can try to address the causative factor or the nidana. But if you try to address the nidana while this is happening, it's not really going to help at all. Okay, so in certain conditions, again, why we look at all these factors? Because we need to determine which is the most appropriate at that particular stage in the presentation of the disease. Okay? So depending on which stage you get the person at, you have to determine what they need to do. And that whatever you do at that stage isn't necessarily going to be the same after a week or after 2 weeks. So here, again, this indicates how important it is for us to constantly reassess what is happening in the person and what is the most appropriate at that particular time or at that particular stage. Okay? Okay. So this is an example of a medicine that is antagonistic to the disease. We have also food that can be antagonistic to the disease. So an example of this is, again, in atisara or diarrhea, you can take food that is bowel binding. An example of this is puffed rice. So for instance, if somebody has really bad diarrhea and they do not have access to kutija or kutija arishta or any one of these other medicines that we have in Ayurveda, if you can get puffed rice, that's going to bind you up real good. And that does that. Another example of this is popcorn. So yes, we don't necessarily love to tell people to eat popcorn, but popcorn will do that. Popcorn makes you it binds your bowels. It will compact it and keep it there. So if a person has really bad diarrhea and they don't have access to all of these other things, if you can find popcorn, eat the popcorn, it's going to stop the diarrhea. Or if you have puffed rice, eat the puffed rice and it's going to stop the diarrhea. Okay? So that's an example of a food that is against the disease. The next one is an activity. So now do you see when we had talked about earlier, when you had learned earlier about previously in your health counselor training, you were looking at the effect of food and activity, right? You were looking at diet and lifestyle. One added factor is now you look at the specifics of when they tell you what food to eat for a condition or for a causative factor, you were looking at this level. Now we are looking at all of it. We're not just looking at the cause of the disease, we're looking at the disease itself, and we're looking at factors that affect both the cause and the disease. Okay? So, an activity or a vihara that is against the disease is an example in udavarta. Udavarta is a condition where there is upward movement of vata. Okay? And an activity you can do to help to promote the downward movement of vata is doing an asana, such as pavana mukta asana. And what that does is that causes or that promotes the downward movement of vata. So that is an activity you can do that really addresses the actual disease condition. Okay? We're not looking at why the vata is moving downwards. We're just trying to get the vata to move downwards. Okay? The next one is ubhaya. Ubhaya means both. So it means that it addresses both the cause of the disease as well as the disease itself. Okay? So an example of a medicine that works against both, in the case of edema caused by vata. Edema is like different types of swelling. So if you have a swelling due to vata, a treatment for that is to use dashamula. Okay, and I'm not going to describe what the dashamula is. It's 10 different types of roots. This is very common, this combination. So dashamula is these 10 different roots, which actually indicates for both vata as well as it works for the disease condition as edema. Dashamula is ideal for addressing or alleviating vata, but it also is very good in using in the case for edema. Okay, so this combination works in both the disease as well as the cause. Another example is food. Food that works for both the disease and the cause. So an example of this is in fever caused due to drinking too much of cold water, you can consume hot soup that with digestive spices. And what that does is it treats the cause, which is basically negating the cold water, as well as it helps the digestive spices helps to negate the issue with the fever. Okay, so this is the cause as well as the disease. And another example is an activity that works for both. Example of this is in drowsiness caused due to sleeping during the day, stay awake at night. Okay, and what that does is in drowsiness, and the drowsiness is usually brought on because of excess moisture or excess kapha. Okay, so staying awake at night does both. It induces dryness in the body, as well as it negates the fact of the disease where you slept too much. Okay, so this disease itself or the condition itself of drowsiness, it will actually help to negate the drowsiness as well as the excess moisture that is caused due to sleeping during the day. Okay, so this is looking at, what that was looking at is things that are opposite. We're looking at opposite factors from the cause and opposite to that of the disease. The next one is a little bit different. And this one actually kind of explains how prabhava works. So remember we learned about prabhava and they talked about these special effects that do not necessarily go along with what you would ideally infer with, a madhura rasa, or a sweet taste that pacifies vata, or a sweet taste that pacifies pitta, or a guna, a light, pacifies kapha, or a vidya or a hot potency pacifies kapha or vata. These are the logical things because they're opposites, right? Which is kind of explained in the previous chart, or the previous table. In this table, this is also a type of upashaya. However, the action here is actually very similar to prabhava, where even though it is not opposite, it still produces a positive effect. Okay? So it is hetu viparita arthakari aushada. And viparita arthakari, which means it seems like it is antagonistic, but it is not actually antagonistic. So that's kind of confusing too. It seems like it is opposite, but it will negate the disease, but in actuality, it is not opposite to the disease. It is actually similar qualities that still negate the condition. Okay? So this is the example of when you use similar qualities to pacify the condition. Okay? So even that can work. And that is really basically how prabhava works. So the specifics of it. If you have a medicine that works against the cause, even though it's not opposite to the cause, example of in pitta type of edema, you apply hot ointment, which normally hot ointment should actually aggravate pitta. But instead, by applying this hot ointment in the pitta type of edema, it actually reduces the condition. Okay, so you see what I mean? It is hot potency or hot quality, which is similar to the actual cause of the condition. It's hot and hot. But even in this hot and hot situation, it still pacifies the condition. So for instance, when we start getting into specific treatment modalities or looking at different interventions, this question may arise. But this doesn't make sense. If this is hot and potency, why is it indicated in a pitta condition? You ever noticed that? Or if this is cold and potency, why is it indicated in a kapha condition? That doesn't make sense. Now you'll start to see why. This is basically the action of prabhava. Okay? So the next is ahara. In a pitta type of edema, use of peppers. And this is actually indicated again in the classical text. Use of peppers, which typically should cause burning sensation, but it actually will help to reduce the causative factor or reduce the pitta in this condition. Okay? And an activity in Vataja Unmada. Unmada is a specific condition or disease that can be loosely translated as a type of insanity, okay? Or it's a type of psychological disorder. And in that, the treatment for it is inducing shock or fear. So not shock therapy, but they mean to shock the person, okay? And usually when you shock someone or when you induce fear, or when someone is fearful, that actually aggravates vata. But in the treatment for vataja type of unmada or vataja type of psychological disorders, you actually want to do this. You want to induce fear or shock them. And that helps to kind of get the vata moving. Sometimes what happens with vata also is vata gets stuck. If vata isn't allowed to flow, sometimes one of the best ways to get it to flow is to induce it to get more aggravated. So it pushes the block out of the way and it flows. So this is the concept of how this activity, though being something that actually aggravates vata, it still will help to pacify the vata type of condition. Okay? Next is you have medicines that are antagonistic to the disease or the vyadhi, okay? And same thing. It seems similar to the disease itself, but it still helps to pacify the disease. So in the case of Chardi or hyperemesis, the treatment that is indicated is the use of Madanaphala. And Madanaphala is actually one herb that is ideal for inducing vomiting. Usually we use this to induce vamana. But this is also indicated in the treatment of a condition known as Chardi or hyperemesis. Okay, so if something induces vomiting, why would you think that that would help in this condition? But it also has this prabhava that even though it induces vomiting, it can also be used to treat conditions such as vomiting. Okay, so that is one type of medicine. That is Vyadhi Viparita Arthakari. Next is a food that works against the disease. In Atisara, there is also indication of milk. Okay, indication of use of milk. And typically, again, milk is something that would induce loose motions. So why would you want to use something that usually induces loose motions in a condition where you already have loose motions? But this, again, if used appropriately in the particular stage where it is indicated, it can actually help to pacify the disease. Next is an activity. So in Chardi, or in the condition of hyperemesis, the treatment for this, or one activity that can be indicated, is bringing about upward movement. So there is, for instance, if you're doing a massage or body work and you're actually pushing things upward, that type of flow or motion or strokes are indicated actually for hyperemesis. Those type of strokes, the upward strokes. And usually upward strokes tend to induce vomiting, but even those upward strokes are actually indicated in hyperemesis. Okay? Next is ubhaya. So there are, again, medicines that seem to be antagonistic or seem to be similar to the cause and the disease, but still help in pacifying the condition. Again, here, prabhava. So in the condition of burns is something, well, you have burnt skin that is caused by fire, and they actually indicate the use of agaru, which is a herb that is very hot in potency. And even though it's hot in potency, it helps to pacify the cause for the burns, as well as the condition of the burns. Okay. Similarly, food in the condition of madatyeya or alcoholism. Madatyeya or alcoholism is considered a disease long before it was termed as a disease in conventional medicine. This is termed as a disease, and this can be found again in Charaka Samhita. I can't remember the chapter, but it is in Chikitsasthana. In Chikitsasthana, in Charaka Samhita, you can find madatyeya as a disease. And in the treatment for madatyeya, they actually indicate the use of very strong alcohol. And so this alcohol is similar to the actual cause for the condition as well as the condition itself, but they indicate that you should intake or you should induce or give the person a very, very strong alcohol when they have this condition of, or this disease of alcoholism. Okay, and that addresses both the cause as well as the disease. Now, how this is used, and I've actually seen this being used, they use very, very strong alcohol mixed with something that's very unpleasant. So one thing that is indicated is by mixing it with donkey's urine, and they give them that to drink. And what that does is that causes them to become very intoxicated, but intoxicated so much so that they end up having a very severe reaction, because the donkey's urine is also very hot in potency, and it enhances even faster absorption of the very strong alcohol. So it causes them to not just be intoxicated, but get to a very high level of intoxication, so much so that they have that adverse reaction and causes them to throw up and vomit and have like really bad hangover. And what that is supposed to do is kind of shock them into having such a bad experience with drinking alcohol that they don't necessarily want to go back to it. It sort of creates an aversion. So this is one thing I actually saw when I was in college. They did this. We mixed donkey's urine with alcohol and gave it to a patient. I know you can't do that here, but that's what's indicated. So this is the concept of how that works. Okay, so the next is activity or vihara. So in the case of vata rakta, or a loose translation being rheumatoid arthritis, the treatment for this indicated is swimming. And they actually say that swimming is favorable in this condition because the swimming actually helps to, the swimming, now typically you would think swimming is something that would increase vata and that would also increase the condition because it's movement and it would further aggravate the arthritis. But swimming actually helps to ground the person and it helps to pacify the condition. It helps to create some amount of movement, which is necessary. So activity such as swimming is indicated in the treatment of vata rakta. Okay, so after all of this information, like I said, I don't expect you to know all of this, but this is really helpful and indicative of what we're going to now start looking at when we look at the intervention indicated for specific conditions. So you have the logical one that you would think of as being, you know, similar increases, dissimilar decreases, as well as the description of the other prabhava or the special reactions of how these different types of medicines work on the cause, the disease, and both. Okay, medicines, food, and activity. Okay, so whatever's there in the classical text, even though sometimes they seem very odd, or it seems like something that we can't adapt or we can't use, there is a logic behind it. So we don't necessarily need to always dismiss it. We need to look at the underlying meaning as to why this has been indicated in this particular condition, because there is a logic and a concept behind how this is producing the effect you want. Okay? And the last part is samprapti or pathogenesis. And this we've kind of talked quite a bit about along the way. Just want to quickly go over this. So it's defined as the process of development of disease and the specific action of the doshas or their role of doshas in the manifestation of disease. So this can just briefly be described as, you know, the aggravation of doshas that take place in many different ways, either due to season, age, diet, lifestyle, etc. Once they are aggravated, the aggravation is determined by what the specific causative factor is that induces that imbalanced state, which then can affect the dhatus and the malas or other organs in the body, and it then evolves. As we saw in that timeline, it evolves into the disease. So that whole timeline or that process is known as samprapti. Even in samprapti, certain times, remember when you talked about samprapti also is considered as the last stage, or in the different types of samprapti, the 6 stages of samprapti, you have bheda, which is the different types. So in that also can be considered in different types of samprapti here, where you have the first type of samprapti is sankhya, or that means number or classification. So you have, for instance, manifestation of 20 types of prameha, or you have the 18 different types of kushta or skin disorders, or you have the 13 different types of sannipata jajwara. So it can be manifested in these 13 different ways, or this prameha condition can be manifested in 20 different ways. Like that, you have sankhya, or this number of different types of pathogenesis. Okay, the next is pradhanya. In the in pathogenesis, we always need to know the predominance of doshas. So this is what my example of the frozen shoulder, which one is predominant or which one comes first. That the swatantra, the primary dosha, and the paratantra, or the secondary dosha. Okay? Or even in the example of the chikungunya, where you have all three doshas, which one is first, which one is second, and which one is third. We need to determine that, and that's why we look at, again, that the stages of samprapti. The next one is Vyadhi, and this is looking at the variety of disease in reference to prognosis. So remember earlier I was telling you about prognosis? So this is prognosis as described in Ayurveda. So there is 4 different types which you can look at. 2 are curable and 2 are incurable. The first 2, which is curable, the first one is known as susadhya or sukhasadhya, which is easily curable. Sukha means happy or easy. So it can be cured very easily. So what do we mean by that? What is easily curable? Well, if the person is young, or if the person has very good control over their senses, which means they have a good, they have a high tolerance level, or if they have very few causative factors, very few nidanas, or even if they have very mild symptoms or very mild rupa, no upadrava, no complications. And when the dosha, dhatu, desha, which means the region, the geographical region, kala, season, or prakriti are dissimilar. And what do we mean by dissimilar? Why would that be easier? Because if they are dissimilar, sometimes what happens is these help to balance off each other, and they reduce the intensity of the condition. So remember in the earlier slide where I had these factors that either feed into the roga or they feed into the rogi. If the factors are dissimilar, then they feed into the rogi, because what happens is with dissimilar qualities, they can balance off each other. So you have one factor that's very hot, one factor that's cold, one factor that's unctuous, and what they do is they balance off each other. So whatever symptoms are being produced cannot be very intense. However, if they are all similar, they all feed into each other, and they all feed into the roga, and they make it worse, or they make the roga stronger. So that will help it to advance. Okay? So in an easily curable condition, all of those factors are dissimilar. And if it is manifested in only one pathway, or the roga marga, only one roga marga, if it is of a recent onset, then this disease is easy to cure, and you require only simple methods such as ahara, vihara, or diet and lifestyle, and it can be treated within a short period of time. It'll go away very quickly. Okay. The next is kritrasadhya, where it is curable with difficulty. So we can still cure it, we can still get rid of it, but it takes more time. It requires more effort. It requires multiple methods of treatment. Of course, has more severe symptoms, may need surgical intervention, because remember in Ayurveda, even though we can't practice it here, but in Ayurveda, they do mention surgical intervention. So kritrasadhya are conditions that may need surgical intervention. Example of that is ashas, hemorrhoids. Even hemorrhoids is described as a disease that we can use surgical procedures. Okay? And other forms of treatment. And such disease, they're curable, but with difficulty. The next is yapya, and yapya comes under the set of incurable diseases. Now, we cannot cure it, but we can manage it. We can get them to a state where they're living somewhat comfortably, but we cannot ever get rid of that. So there are diseases in Ayurveda that are indicated as yapya, or incurable but manageable. So this conception, I've heard people say that Ayurveda can cure all diseases. That's not true. Or Ayurveda can cure diabetes. That's not true. Because diabetes is considered as a yapya disease. Similarly, shwasa or asthma, chronic asthma is also considered as a Yapya disease. Now, looking at that, it is something that we can manage. We can manage it by appropriate diet and lifestyle, and we can try to make sure that it doesn't necessarily aggravate, but we cannot ever get rid of it. We can't ever tell you that you're diabetes free or you're asthma free. Once it has crossed over, now asthma is a condition that if it is of recent onset or if the person is young, then it is in the susadya or the kritrasadya. But once it becomes chronic, then it can enter into the Yapya stage. And once it enters into the Yapya stage, then we can't reverse it back after that. Okay, and even that has been described in the classical texts. So the Yapya conditions, they tend to get triggered by minor factors, and it always keeps the person a little bit susceptible to other disease conditions, because if you have a disease that is there lifelong, it means that your immunity or your bala, the rogi bala, is naturally lower because the roga bala is much stronger, and the roga bala is consistent. We can't ever get rid of that. We can reduce it a little bit, but we can't get rid of it. And because we can't get rid of it, it always is going to affect the rogi bala or the person's strength. Okay? And the last is asadhya, which is completely incurable. We can't do anything about it. We can't touch it. All treatments will fail. And it also indicates that there will be signs or fatal signs that indicate imminent death. Okay? So, and also in conditions where there's loss of sensory function, those are asadhya or incurable conditions. Okay? There isn't anything we can do about it. So in Ayurveda, there are conditions that we know that we cannot cure, that it's beyond our scope of practice. Okay? So we do not take every single thing on. We know where our limitations are at. Okie dokie. So the next is looking at samprapti, the proportional analysis of the doshas and their involvement in disease. And that's looking at, remember what we talked about earlier, either the quality of the dosha that's aggravated or the function or even the quantity. Okay, let me just get through this last bit. And the last bits or classification types of samprapti is bala, which is looking at the understanding the strength of the disease by looking at the factors such as Nidana, purva, rupa, age, season, etc. And also looking at the time of the manifestation of disease. Kala is the last one, looking at how it either aggravates or gets worse. So this is, for instance, when we ask, oh, does it get worse during the midday, or does it get worse during the nighttime or in the middle of the night, or do you find it gets worse in the spring or in the summertime? That's looking at that particular stage or that particular part of the samprapti or pathogenesis. Example of this is seasonal allergies. That happens because of a specific season, tends to aggravate more. So an example, what is a classical example is in kapha jwara, that is occurring in the spring season, gets worse at the kapha time of day and kapha time of night, and immediately after consumption of food, which is the kapha stage of digestion. Okay? Okay, so now that I have completely confused you with a lot of information, I just want you to know, I expect that you will have a lot of questions. And if you do, that's great. You should have questions. I don't expect you to understand this immediately. But remember that these questions are good because it means that you got some of it, and that's processing. So in the processing method, some questions are coming out, some doubts. And what we're going to do is we're going to try and answer those so that it processes even more and it gets even deeper and even deeper and even deeper, so that when we are applying this information and we're actually using this in description of disease and treatment, then it's going to become, oh, I know this. Oh, yeah, I heard this before. Oh, now I get it. Instead of going directly there and then coming up with these questions. Well, I don't understand how this could happen, or this doesn't seem to make any sense. Why would we want to use this particular therapy in this condition when it's contradictory? So that's the reason why I wanted to get this information to you before, so that when we start looking at the specific treatments, now it's going to at least not, it won't be the first time you've heard this. You would have gotten the concepts or the base beforehand. Okay? So always keep this recording handy, because we're going to keep coming back to this again and again and again. Okay. So I know we don't have much time left for questions, but if you like, you can ask some now, or if you want, you can save it till the weekend and we can address some of the questions at that time.
Sounds like they're full to me.
I would expect so. I knew when I was writing this that it was going to be a lot. But then when I was looking at the practitioner guidelines, it's even more detailed, actually a lot more than this is there.
Right.
So in looking at trying to keep you guys updated or in along that line, I want to make sure that we don't miss anything. So even though it may seem overwhelming, we're going to keep coming across this, and we're going to keep using this information.
Right. This will keep coming up through all the modules. So
yes, it will. It will. And even some of what we've already learned, hopefully it should have started to show up a little bit of a little bit of check marks there. Oh, I think I heard this, or I think this makes sense now. So hopefully some little check marks would have gone off. The little flags may have gone off.
Did there was a question there. Did you answer Betty's question there?
In which volume should you read about disease? If you're looking at just the Nidana or just the causative factors, you can read about it in volume 2. Volume 2 of Charaka Samhita is, the first part is Nidanasthana. And Nidanasthana talks only about the causative factors and the pathogenesis of disease. However, in Charaka Samhita Nidanasthana, they've only described 8 diseases. If you go to Chikitsasthana, they describe a lot more. They have, I think, about 26 chapters in Chikitsasthana. And so there are 26 different diseases that are described in Chikitsasthana. So if you want to read more about other diseases, you can find it in Chikitsasthana that may not necessarily be there in Nidanasthana. Okay, so you can refer to either Nidana, which is in volume 2, or Chikitsa, which is volume 3, 4, and 5. 3, 4, and 5. Where would you find autoimmune diseases lie? In autoimmune diseases also, it really depends on the causative factor and the pathogenesis. So you look at the Nidana and the Samprapti of that, because all autoimmune diseases aren't necessarily the same. They don't fall under any one roga. They're kind of lapsing over multiple different disorders or diseases in Ayurveda, depending on what it's presenting as. So what we look at when it's presenting is we look at, again, what the causative factor is. Could it be something due to their diet and lifestyle, or their prakriti, or what makes them susceptible to having this condition? Could it be because of that? Or does it have an issue with a hereditary factor? Because certain autoimmune diseases can be due to hereditary factors as well. So we look at what are the possible causative factors that is feeding into their body reacting in this way. And not necessarily all autoimmune diseases, what is termed as autoimmune diseases, is looked at in the same manner in Ayurveda. We don't necessarily see that it's your body working against you. we look at what is causing this reaction. So if you again go through this video and go through this PowerPoint, you'll look and see that every single disease, we go through the same process of looking at what were the causative factors, what has helped it progress along, and what are the trigger factors that is causing it to then manifest. And when someone gets diagnosed with an autoimmune disease, even in that, depending on which stage they caught it at, it could be in an initial stage where it still is waiting for a trigger factor to manifest, or it could be in the last stages where it has already manifested and already has complications, and it's then considered as something difficult to cure. Now, we don't say that, again, depending on where it's manifested, depending on what the signs and symptoms are, depending on the samprapti, we can then determine whether it is curable or whether it is incurable, okay? So our process of diagnosis, which is what we've been looking at in these two videos, is quite different than what you look at or the process that's used in conventional medicine. And it's always important for us to keep this in mind, because when we try to look at those diagnoses and fit it into our concept of disease, you end up with sometimes things that are contradictory or that are clashing. And this is the reason why, because our approach to understanding the disease is very different than the approach that determined this particular disease with this particular name in conventional medicine. Their process is different, okay? So what their process of how they determine, oh, well, this is the disease that this person has, and this is the name where we can term it as this particular roga, may not necessarily be what we consider as this particular roga, okay? So hopefully that has somewhat answered your question. We're going to keep coming up with this again and again. I understand that. And our thought process has sort of developed in this manner that, oh, we can correlate. Sometimes you can, but then sometimes you just can't. Sometimes our process, we're looking at it in a completely different manner. And this happens a lot, especially in the next one that we're going to look at, where we look at vata rogas. Because vata is something that we know exists, but cannot be measured. So what you end up with is a lot of signs and symptoms without a particular disease name. And this is what tends to happen a lot with the autoimmune diseases, is because they're termed as autoimmune disease because they can't exactly figure out where to put it, or it can't really fall under the definition of this, or this. So it can be under this general definition, or it can fall under this other factor, because we just don't know. In Ayurveda, we look at, again, the doshas. We look at this whole process that we just described. And in that, you can look at factors like vata, where we don't need an instrument to measure it, because there isn't an instrument that measures vata. Maybe you can measure breath to some extent, but you can't measure other functions of vata. You can't measure when vata gets increased. If somebody has gulma, which is considered as very loosely, sometimes incorrectly translated as abdominal tumors or distension of the abdomen. Gulma is a condition where vata increases, it is lodged in the abdominal area, and it just distends. That is more of a description of gulma than just an abdominal tumor. And it just distends and distends and distends. And it looks almost like a phantom pregnancy. To that extent, the abdomen can distend. And that's where it is a very serious condition. So it's a disease, but how do you describe that? What do you term that as, in conventional medicine? So sometimes there aren't translations. So sometimes we just need to look at it purely in a perspective of Ayurveda to figure out what doshas are involved. Where did this start from? How did it get to this particular point? Okay? And then according to that, once we figure out that picture, then it's very easy to figure out what we need to do to negate it. Okay?
Okay, very good. All right, well, let's wrap it up, and you guys certainly can send questions off to Anusha, and it'll feed into our weekend. And you have a wonderful night. We'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks, Anusha.
You're welcome.